future generations, your generation, will for the first time in 200 years almost certainly be poorer than your predecessor generation. Well, thank you for inviting me back again, and I'm sorry that you have to switch into English for this session. I'm sorry also that I can't join your other sessions, although it's nice to speak to you in the breaks. I only speak one language, which is English, and sometimes in England people say, oh, it's such a pity that more English people don't speak more languages, but there is an opportunity cost of learning languages, of course. Everything has an opportunity cost. And when I was 13, I had to choose between carry on learning French, which I really didn't like, and or doing economics. So the opportunity cost of doing economics was not doing French, and that was a very low opportunity cost. And so it's why I'm here today. I wouldn't be here today if I'd not taken that decision. But maybe also it illustrates why I might be able to speak other languages, but then not be able to come and talk about these things, which wouldn't be very helpful. This is quite a long title, Global Demography, Fiscal Collapse, Government Spending and Debt, and it's just nouns and adjectives. There are no questions like, what shall we do, or what policy decisions shall we take, or whatever, because in a sense, there's nothing much we can do. The problems we face now are a result of decisions that we've taken in the past, and my outlook is going to be quite pessimistic. You know, we've built up this mass of government debt, as well as created these systems of social insurance, which mean that young people like you effectively have obligations to older people like me, and in terms of providing healthcare and pensions and so on. And it's very difficult to reverse those decisions. Is it possible for the electorate, the government, for younger people to say, well, I've reached a certain age and I won't get a pension or I won't get healthcare. You should have saved for yourself, when the system was based on the assumption that every generation of taxpayers would pay for the pensions and healthcare of the older generation that preceded it. So I've got to be fairly gloomy about this, and I think some governments, some countries will find themselves in very difficult positions. And it's interesting that we have quite a lot of discussion about something which is sometimes described as climate justice, and occasionally in that context intergenerational justice. This is Greta Thunberg here. And you don't have to agree with everything she says. Indeed, you could agree with almost nothing that she says. To accept that it is conceivable that in relation to environmental issues, the climate and so on, that this generation might be taking actions which lead us to be consuming in such a way that it damages the prospects of the next generation, and that this is in some sense an injustice. I mean, in general, it's an injustice to take something that doesn't belong rightfully to us at the expense of others. And some people in this sphere would argue that we are consuming in such a way that we're impairing the ability of future generations to have better living standards because of the impact on the environment. Now, of course, Greta Thunberg isn't the only person who has talked about these types of things, and Pope Francis has made this link rather more strongly. In fact, he wrote an encyclical letter, as it's called, on the environment, called Laudato Si, in 2015, or sometimes sort of nicknamed Caring for Our Common Home. There's going to be a sequel, Laudato sequel, perhaps, published on October the 4th to sort of update this letter. And there's a section in this encyclical letter which is actually called Justice Between the Generations, when he talks about these kinds of issues. Now, if you think that the environment is only for popes and left-wing activists, in fact, the first politician really to talk about the environment in quite considered terms to take it really quite seriously as an issue is Margaret Thatcher. There's Margaret Thatcher when she was a research chemist, when she was rather younger. And she gave an address to the Conservative Party conference 35 years ago in which she said, "No generation has a freehold on the earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease. This government intends to meet the terms of that lease in full." And she went on to explain really how, again, our generation shouldn't take decisions in relation to the environment that damages the prospects of future generations. Now, of course, her views on how to deal with the questions that faced us would have been very different from Greta Thunberg and her allies, who believe that the way to deal with environmental problems is to dismantle capitalism, as if somehow that had succeeded previously in producing better environmental outcomes, which it certainly hasn't. But it is strange that those on the left who are generally most vocal in these debates about the environment never seem to turn their attention to problems of government debt, government spending, fiscal burdens that we're leaving to future generations, nor social insurance systems which provide healthcare and pensions to older people funded, or, well, not funded, paid for by the taxes of younger generations of people. It's almost as if they have a rather incomplete view of this question of intergenerational justice, as Pope Francis called it. Now, so let's have a look at some numbers to start with. So this is the national debt as a percentage of national income of 8 countries. They're kind of more or less chosen at random. They're certainly not chosen to illustrate a particular point. You've got Australia there, which has always had a relatively low national debt. Japan, which until recent decades had a low national debt, has increased it dramatically. You've got the USA and UK, where the pattern is fairly similar. Some European countries, including Italy and Greece. But what is very clear is that for all of those countries, as for nearly every country in the world, in fact, the national debt as a percentage of national income has increased dramatically. And this is not just due to the pandemic and the financial crisis, the pandemic of 2020, 2021, and the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Many countries had very significant increases in their national debts well before the the financial crisis arose. And also, alarmingly, there was 12 years between the financial crisis and the pandemic, and really no countries at all made significant inroads into reducing their national debt in that period. Now, some people say that this doesn't matter. It's just, sometimes the phrase is used, well, we all owe it to each other. So debt, the government debt is just owed by people within the country to other people within the country. It all cancels each other out. Some quite respectable economists actually use that argument. But I'm afraid it really does matter. That not only is a lot of national debt held by people overseas, so the UK, for example, about 1/3 of our national debt is owed to overseas buyers of UK securities. In the United States, probably a bit more. But it's not a case of we all owe it to each other. It's a case of future generations of taxpayers owe this money to people who have bought government bonds. And the people who have bought government bonds expect to have those government bonds repaid, and they expect to have interest on those government bonds paid. And indeed, if they don't, they may well not receive their pension or whatever, because people who are saving for their pensions are doing so by investing in government bonds amongst many other types of investment instruments. So these, the national debt really does matter. It's not just something which you sort of can cancel out within a country. It's a very real debt which future generations of taxpayers, people like you, owe to those who have bought the government bonds which governments issue to finance debt. And in fact, these high levels of government debt are imposing a very real burden already. You know, in countries such as Greece and Italy, the costs of servicing the national debt are absolutely huge. And there are very significant reductions in other forms of government spending have been made necessary in order to service government debt. But even in the UK, the service of the national debt, in other words, the interest that governments are paying, so just the interest, nothing to do with repaying the debt, just the interest on the government's debt in the UK is over 10% of government spending. So the UK government spends more on interest on its debt than it does on defence, internal security and protection, and law and order, all put together. In other words, it spends more on debt interest than on the traditional functions of a liberal state. And that proportion will rise very significantly. I've just got to be slightly trivial for a moment. If you were to, so this is a, I was going to say it's a pile of dollar bills, actually, it's a pile of $100 bills, but that doesn't really matter. If you were to lay dollar bills end to end of an amount sufficient to repay the US government debt, then those dollar bills would reach the sun and back 16 times. Each dollar bill is 4/1000ths of an inch thick. I guess that's about 2/1000ths of a centimetre. 4/1000ths of an inch thick. If you were to, again, take the piles of dollar bills necessary to repay the US government debt and put them in 9 piles next to each other, then those 9 piles would all reach the moon. And the total level of the US government debt is $32 trillion, which is equal to $90,000 per person in the US. Not even per taxpayer. When I say per person, of course, I'm including children, etc., etc. So that is a sum of money which each person in the US owes to those who have bought government debt instruments, US government debt instruments, which will include, of course, the Chinese government and many foreign buyers of US government debt. Now, I do sometimes wonder that if these numbers are just so large that people bury their heads in the sand and don't really think about it, or don't really want to think about it. But there are actually many economists who argue that it doesn't matter. So some economists argue it doesn't matter because, as they say, we all owe it to everybody else. Other economists argue it doesn't matter because we've had very high levels of government borrowing and government debt in the past, and the levels we got now are not very different from those in the past. So let's have a look at, and that statement on face value is not untrue. Now, the only country for which you can get a very, very long history of trajectory of figures for government debt is actually the UK, as it happens. So this graph here traces the UK government debt as a proportion of national income all the way back to 1692 up to the current time, 2023 or 2022. And you can see it rises throughout the 18th century, it then peaks. There's a peak again 100 years later, and then there's another peak, and then it falls dramatically, and then there's because they're so close together you can't really see it, but there's another peak there and a final peak here. It's just probably the UK national debt is just peaking again. It may now start to fall very, very, very slowly. Can anybody tell me what those peaks relate to? Yeah. Okay, so this is 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, okay, Battle of Waterloo. Yeah. First World War. Second World War, the little peak. It's 2008, actually. It's a financial crisis. And then the pandemic. Okay. So the argument goes, well, we had government debt after the Napoleonic Wars of 200% of national income, after the Second World War of 250% of national income, and we dealt with this, and we can deal with it. We can deal with it again. It's quite something, actually, that you could take a time series of 220 years up until the financial crisis, and you can explain its peaks by 3 events, and all 3 events are wars. It's a bit more worrying that you then have 2 events within 12 years of each other, neither of which are wars, which then have created peaks in the national debt. You know, is there going to be another pandemic? Is there going to be some other serious crisis which will just lead to debt carrying on spiraling? But those economists who say that we don't need to worry about debt because we've been here before are wrong for at least 2 reasons. Firstly, reducing national debt. After the Napoleonic Wars, after the First World War, after the Second World War, was not in any sense a painless process. It was an incredibly painful process. I'm wearing, you heard about inflation this morning, I think. The cufflinks I'm wearing are actually made out of silver threepenny bits, so 3-pence coins, from 1931. And as a result of decimalisation, that's equivalent to 1.3 pence in today's money, today's coinage. And 1.3 pence in 1931 would buy what a pound will buy today. So in the post-war period in the UK, we had devastating inflation. This destroyed the value of government debt. So people who bought UK government bonds after the Second World War, they bought long-dated bonds which had a very long period to redemption. They had a fixed rate of interest, which was fixed at around 3%. And then inflation over the period which they held those bonds for, the following, say, 40 years, was on average 6%. In other words, for the privilege of investors lending the government their money, they actually got paid back in money which bought less than the money that they lent the government in the first place. And not only did that destroy the value of government debt, no, for the following, in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s, it made life extremely difficult for the UK government to borrow money at all at reasonable levels of interest rates. That always happens when you have high levels of inflation. Also, the high inflation in the UK led to the industrial strife of the 1970s. The 1970s, the UK was described as the sick man of Europe, a phrase which was used to describe Turkey in earlier centuries, but it was used to describe Britain in the 1970s because of the devastating effects of inflation. So that's one way that you can deal with high levels of debt. You can print money and pay the holders of your debt back with money that's worth less. But that's not a painless process. And we'll see some more stark examples of that in a second. After the First World War, and for 100 years after the Napoleonic Wars, there were decades of austerity where government spending was much lower than the taxes that the government took in. And again, this was a really painful process. The population had to endure high taxes for a very long period of time and or low levels of government spending. And in the 1920s in particular, this had really serious social consequences for the UK. So you can't just dismiss our current level of debt by saying, okay, we've been there before, we've had high levels of debt, we dealt with it. We did, but it was extremely painful. And then if you think about Germany after the First World War and the debts which the Allies imposed on Germany, many people I think would argue that led directly, or at least rather indirectly, to the Second World War because of the social consequences of that debt and the way it was handled. And then after the euro crisis, in the financial crisis, Greece and Italy, whose debt rose very dramatically to 150, 200% of national income, they effectively lost their sovereignty and had technocratic governments imposed upon them by a mixture of the IMF and the European Union. So the idea that just because we've had high levels of debt in the past, it's okay, we'll deal with it in the future, it's just simply not true. It will be a very painful process dealing with the levels of government debt that many countries have at the moment. But there's something which makes this even worse, much, much, much worse. So in addition to governments acquiring huge amounts of debt, they've also designed welfare systems whereby generations of voters effectively vote themselves entitlements in old age, which will be paid for, which will be financed by future generations of taxpayers, without making any provision, without providing any capital funds, without any guarantees that the demographics of countries will be sufficiently stable so that the future generations of taxpayers will be sufficiently numerous to pay for the healthcare costs and the pensions costs of future future old people. And in relation to these systems of social insurance, everything really that could go wrong is going wrong. You've got people are living longer, people are having fewer children, and productivity is slowing down. And I'm going to suggest that this is creating a vicious circle, which is actually quite difficult to get out of. So we often call these systems of social insurance pay-as-you-go social insurance systems. In other words, in most countries they started after the Second World War, so the generation after the Second World War sets up these systems, it votes itself entitlements, those entitlements are due in old age, but no funding is set aside. You wait until those people grow old, and then you tax the younger generation in order to pay for the healthcare and pensions. And this is true even in countries such as Germany or Holland, where you have very considerable amounts of private involvement in the provision of healthcare. These systems are still, they're not funded in advance, they're paid for by the generations of taxpayers that follow. Now, this kind of thing can work if the population structure is stable. If you have the young people become old, they don't live any longer than previous generations, they have enough children to carry on paying the taxes for, to ensure the pensions and healthcare costs and so on can be financed, then that can work. And I guess we assumed that this is what, or people assumed that this is what would happen, except when we had devastating diseases. Really, for centuries, the population had either been stable in most countries or had grown, and in industrial times, it had grown quite rapidly. But people are living longer, pension ages are not increasing to keep up with that, and people are having fewer children, and in many countries, the working population is already falling. So here's some statistics which sort of, again, not chosen particularly to make a point. I think these are relatively representative. So life expectancy in Poland in 1960 was 68. Today it's 77. In Germany it was 70. Today it's 81. In the UK, 71 and 81. Italy, 70 and 83. Australia, 71 and 83. So when these systems were set up, people expected to receive a pension. Well, many people died before pension age, but people expected to receive a pension for 2, 3, 4 years. It was very unusual for people to receive a pension for, say, 15 or 20 years. I've come across people, and there'll be even more in Germany, who've actually received a pension for longer than they were working. They've managed to take early retirement at the age of 56, 57, 58. If they're women, that was certainly possible in England. Women live longer, of course. They live until they're 100. So they work for 33, 34 years or something and then receive a pension for nearly 40 years. And some countries have nudged up their pension ages. Italy has done quite well there from a very low pension age. And the UK is trying to automatically link its pension age to life expectancy, but in general, life expectancy has increased much faster than pension ages have. So, even if nothing else happened, pensions would cost much more. How much more I'll talk about in a moment. Then if you look at the average number of children families used to have, now if you allow for people dying when they're young, youngsters growing up and not having children and that type of thing, a country needs to have a fertility rate, an average number of children per family, of about 2.1 if the population is going to remain stable. And most countries were well above that in 1960. And today, they are way below it. So on average in Italy, families have 1.25 children. In the UK, a little bit more, 1.53, Poland, 1.33. And many Southeast Asian countries, South Korea, Singapore, the numbers are even lower, getting on towards an average of one child per family. Now, even putting aside the financial issues that I'll talk about later, this has pretty devastating social effects. Even if people fully funded their pensions through capital saving and their health care through capital saving and so on, there's a limit to the extent to which you can replace people by machines. But also just the social consequences of very, very small families are quite serious. So I saw a statistic recently which suggested that, I might have got this slightly wrong, but not very wrong, by 2060, I think, 50% of Italians would have no brother or sister, no cousin, no auntie or uncle, nephew or niece, and of course then their parents will die. In other words, 50% of Italians will have no close relatives at all. And that's not, I don't think that's a very nice place to be socially, aside from anything else. There's only so much fulfillment you can get from talking to one of those machines. Is it called Cortana or something that you can sort of talk to, and they'll make you a cup of coffee or something. Now, these trends are going to become quite advanced quite quickly, and I'll come to that in a second. But if you combine together falling fertility with people living longer in old age, you can project what the ratio is going to be of people of tax-paying age to people of pension age. So essentially, as far as these statistics are concerned, people between ages 18 and 65 and people over the age of 65. So it's ignoring children, who of course are also dependents, in addition to old people. So if you go back to 1960, in Poland, there were 9.5 people of tax-paying age. Of course, not all of them would have been working. Some of them would have been in education. Some of them would have been caring for children or whatever. But there were 9.5 people of tax-paying age for every person of pension age. Today, there's 3.3, and by 2050, there'll be 1.7. In Germany, those numbers are 5.2 by 2050, also 1.7 as it happens. In the UK, slightly better position. In Italy, which I've already mentioned as being especially problematic in this regard, only 1.3 people of working age to every person above pension age. Australia has a younger population and more immigration, and immigrants tend to have more children as well. So countries which have had a lot of immigration in the last 2 or 3 decades will do better in this regard than countries which haven't. So if we just focus on that Italy number for a moment, 1.3. So there's 1.3 people of tax-paying age to every person who is of pension age. Now, not all of those 1.3 people of tax-paying age will actually be working and paying taxes. The participation rate in the labour force in Italy is about 66%. So of those 1.3 people of tax-paying age, about 0.85 people will be working. So essentially you've got 0.85 people producing and 1.45 dependents, those people of tax-paying age who, for whatever reason, are not working, plus everybody plus those of pension age. And that's ignoring children, although there aren't many children, as it happens. Now, this is an impossible situation. It's impossible to really to envisage how in a country like Italy, but for that matter also South Korea, Singapore and others, to a marginally lesser extent Germany, will cope with having so few taxpayers per people of older age in receipt of pensions and also in need probably of substantial healthcare and social care spending. About half of all healthcare spending is in the last 2 years of people's lives. So healthcare spending is very strongly correlated with age. So in Japan, just to sort of put these figures in context, that the working age population is already falling quite dramatically. So in the next 7 years, the working population in Japan will fall by about 3.5 million. And the number of people of pension age will rise by about 3.5 million. In Germany, a similar thing will happen. Number of people of working age will fall by about 2.5 million, and the number of people of pension age will rise by about 2.5 million. In China, China is now moving to the point where it has a declining population, or will have a declining population quite sharply, quite soon. And its working population in the next 7 years will fall by 20 million. But if you want to see a really stark figure, in South Korea, the birth rate is so low that the population of South Korea will more than halve between now and 2100, from 52 million to 24 million. And these things are too late to reverse. You know, even if people have started having lots more children now, it will be another 20 years before they're actually in the labour force paying taxes. You know, demography turns round very, very slowly. And you might think, okay, we'll solve this by migration. But actually most migration, or at least much migration, is taking place between countries where the birth rate has fallen within the countries where the migrants are coming from, countries like Bulgaria, Albania, etc. So if you take Bulgaria as an example, Bulgaria is likely to see its population decline by about a quarter in the next 25 years, and migration to other EU countries will be the main cause of that decline. So essentially it's a phrase we use in the UK, rearranging the deck chairs on the decks of the Titanic. But migration is not solving anybody's problem. Migration from African countries might, to some extent. Migration from India might, to some extent. But in general, migration is happening from countries which already themselves have very, very low birth rates. Countries like Bulgaria and Albania, they're almost emptying out. I haven't talked about Russia, but the population of Russia is also going into very steep decline. Now, this problem is serious enough, but if you have funded pension systems, like most things within a market economy, they tend to be self-correcting. So, if I save for my pension through the accumulation of capital, and I accumulate a capital sum, I get close to retirement, I have to use that capital sum to buy an annuity, and that provides me with my pension, and people are having fewer children, then what will tend to happen if people are having fewer children is that there'll be fewer people of working age, so wages will rise, and that will encourage me to stay in the labour market and earn money for longer, and maybe defer retiring. So as in most instances where you have a provision within a market economy, there's a self-correcting mechanism, even if you can't solve all problems to do with demography and ageing by having capital-funded pensions. So in some countries, Chile, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, there's very considerable capital funding of pensions, and we wouldn't expect these problems to be as serious. But where you have pensions paid for by future generations of taxpayers, you can end up, indeed I think we will end up, with a vicious circle. In other words, every response to the problem will actually make the problem worse. And the reason for that is because pensions, healthcare entitlements, social care entitlements, and so on are determined by governments which are elected on a universal franchise, and a bigger proportion of the electors, of course, are the older people who will want to ensure that their interests are protected. So this is the, I only have these figures for the UK. So this graph here shows you the share of the UK adult population which is over the age of 55, which is the top line, and 65, the bottom line, from 1971 projected up to 2050. And in the UK, in the UK's electoral system, a political party needs about 40% of the vote in order to form a government. Well, already, so this is the current time here, already around 40% of all voters are within sight, within 10 years of receiving a pension. They're not going to be voting for political parties which are promising to reduce pensions, or promising to reduce spending on healthcare, or promising to reduce spending on social care. And that's why in the United Kingdom you've got a Conservative Party which has dramatically increased welfare spending on pensioners in the last 13 years, despite supposedly being a party which believes in smaller government spending. But it's funded that increase in spending on older people's welfare by cutting welfare to younger people, charging younger people for higher education, etc. So there's been a transfer of resources from younger people to older people, and maybe that's exactly what you would expect as the proportion of the electorate, as the electorate ages. But it's actually worse than this, because young people don't vote. Well, I mean, they do, obviously, but not to the same extent as older people vote. So these 4 lines here are the proportion, so 0.5 means 50%, 0.7, 70%, etc. They are the proportion of people of different ages who actually bother to turn out and vote in elections. So if you take the 2017 election, only about 50% of 18 to 34-year-olds voted. On the other hand, the yellow line here at the top, nearly 90% of people over the age of 65 voted. So when you sort of combine those figures with these figures, you get an active electorate, if you like, that part of the electorate which is actually voting, which is aging very rapidly. And there is no question that in most countries, those people are voting to protect the benefits in healthcare, social care, and pension systems that they promised themselves in earlier decades. In few countries have you had any significant reduction in state pension or healthcare provision. Quite the reverse. But another reason why you get, so that's one reason why you get a vicious circle. Pension entitlements, healthcare entitlements are determined by the government, not by people's own savings choices. The government is elected by the people as a whole, and those electing the government are on average getting older. But the other reason why you get a vicious circle is because there's a very strong relationship between the level of taxation or government spending and economic growth. Roughly speaking, most of the empirical studies in this area tend to suggest that a 10 percentage point increase in government spending as a proportion of national income, say from 30% to 40% of national income, will lead to a reduction in economic growth of 1 percentage point. Now, when you're talking about average economic growth being about 2%, that 10% increase in government spending or taxation, 10 percentage points increase, will sort of halve economic growth. And of course, if economic growth is lower, then tax revenues will be lower. There'll be lower tax revenues in order to pay for the healthcare and pensions that older people have voted themselves. So if you just look at the UK, and the UK is by no means the most serious example, I'll come back to these figures later when I explain a bit more about them. The UK government reckons that as a result of the ageing of the population alone, if nothing else changes, then government spending on healthcare and pensions and social care will have to increase by 12 percentage points of national income in order to fund those costs resulting from the ageing of the population. Now, I'll mention in a moment that I just don't think that's possible. So I don't know how the circle is going to be squared. But that's a huge increase in the tax burden. And economic growth in the UK at the moment is about 1%, and has been for a decade. No, that suggests that an increase of the tax burden of that magnitude could just eliminate economic growth. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I'll explain this in a moment, but that's a 50-year time frame, actually. Yeah. And a third, another aspect of how this vicious circle is reinforced is that young people are in a position, due to higher taxes on families, a range of other things as well, I guess, where they can't afford to have as many children as they used to have. So that just makes the problem worse. Now, quite a lot of work is done in quantifying this, the total costs of these social security liabilities, these pensions costs, healthcare costs that will emerge over the coming decades. And I sometimes call this the debt iceberg. And the reason for that is because these sorts of costs we never really talk about. If the German government or the Austrian government tells you what its national debt is, it will tell you that figure on the very first slide here. It won't tell you what the value of the obligations are to future generations of pensioners and future generations of old people in terms of health and social care costs. It's kind of below the radar. It's off the government accounts. Governments require, if you're a private company and you hire workers and you promise those workers a pension when they retire, you're required by the government, by government accounting standards, to put the value of those pensions on your balance sheet. And as the value of the pensions goes on your balance sheet, they then have to go through the profit and loss account and they reduce your profits. So governments don't do, in terms of accounting for these future obligations, what they actually require of private companies. So, if you're an elector, if you're reading financial newspapers, etc., you don't really hear about these future obligations that governments have, and which they can't wriggle out of, and which are not part of the official national debt. So that's why I call it the debt iceberg. You've got this huge part, really, of the national debt below the waterline, which is more or less invisible. So the European Union has calculates for a range of countries, for all European Union countries, what it describes as the fiscal adjustment. And the fiscal adjustment is the increase in taxes or decrease in government spending, which is required from this very moment and forever, in order to ensure that all of the healthcare costs and pensions costs arising from the aging population will be covered by taxation. Now, in making those calculations, the European Union doesn't take into account the fact that if taxes rise, then economic growth will fall, so tax revenue might actually fall rather than rise. But for most EU countries, this is around 6 percentage points, which doesn't sound very much. Just to run through a few examples, Slovenia, Slovakia and Malta need to make a fiscal adjustment of 10 percentage points. Belgium, Czechia, Luxembourg, Hungary, 6 to 8 percentage points. Ireland, the Netherlands, Romania and Poland, Austria, Bulgaria, Finland, Germany, Spain and Italy, between 2 and 6 percentage points. But in most EU countries, taxes are already so high. The idea of raising the tax burden by another 6 percentage points of national income, it's more or less impossible. If you tried to do that, governments would actually just end up with less revenue because of the impact on economic growth. There is a limit to the extent to which governments can actually tax their populations. But not only that, not only if governments tried to do this, they would find it impossible to raise the revenue, there's actually no prospect of this happening in the near future. So every year you delay this, the bigger the ultimate adjustment has to be. So if governments don't actually take any action for 10 or 20 years, that 6 percentage points will become 9 or 10 percentage points. And eventually, the governments will just run out of money because the pension and healthcare costs will come along, but there'll be no tax revenues there to pay for them. And none of this, I should say, deals with existing explicit government debt, the bit above the waterline, nor does it allow for more spending on other things. And there are just continual pressures for governments to spend money on other things, whether it's achieving net zero or whatever. Now, there are a couple of other ways in which these obligations are measured. And rather than looking at the adjustment to tax and government spending that's needed now and forever in order to meet these obligations, what the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility does is something slightly different, and it looks at what will happen to the UK's national debt if there is no change in taxation or government spending policy. In other words, if our government just carried on with its current tax rules and its current government spending plans and nothing changed other than the population getting older. And the conclusion of our own Office for Budget Responsibility is that our national debt rises to between 300% and 400% of national income over 50 years. No country has survived a national debt of that level and remained intact without something happening such as mass default, hyperinflation, or the country entirely losing its independence or civil breakdown. And in Ireland, what their the Ministry of Finance do is they put a value on all the pension obligations, all the value of all these pension obligations that the government will have to meet, using the same techniques that they require of private companies. And if you do that, then in Ireland, the costs of these pension obligations, the debt that you would have to put on your balance sheet if you were a private company, is about 300% of national income. That's just pension obligations, nothing to do with healthcare costs or anything else. But these numbers kind of look consistent with each other. However you do this, and you can come at it from a number of different directions, you get fairly consistent results. Okay, so now to wind up. The economist Richard Wagner has talked about how governments create a fiscal commons, essentially, where the idea of the tragedy of the commons is that if you have common land which is not owned by anybody, then people will put their cattle onto that common land and they'll graze it to the maximum extent possible, and the common land will get grazed to the until it's no longer fertile. If that common land is then owned, the owner can restrict the grazing to ensure that the land is sustainable in the long run and there aren't too many cattle on it at any one time. And Richard Wagner has sort of drawn an analogy there with our fiscal systems. And what we're essentially doing is voting ourselves, or at least older generations have, benefits, pensions, future healthcare, social insurance systems, social care costs, etc., which are going to be, the burden of which is going to be spread across society as a whole. So I'm taking decisions, as an electorate, or decades ago, the electorate took decisions to impose costs on other people to vote themselves benefits without in any sense making a sacrifice themselves for those benefits, which is a bit like a sort of how on common land, if we all put our cattle on the common land, we try and get some benefit without actually restraining our behaviour in any way, and the common land eventually gets overgrazed. Well, similarly, the fiscal system gets overgrazed, and as Margaret Thatcher once said, you eventually run out of other people's money. And that's what's happened. Not only have we run out of other people's money, but we've run out of the money of future generations, is really what I'm suggesting. So what might happen? Well, some countries might well just sort of scrape through. If countries adopt sensible policies, try and keep the lid on government spending, try to raise pension ages, try to squeeze pension benefits, try to bring in private funding alongside state funding, even if it's several decades too late to do that, introduce introduce reforms which increase productivity and economic growth. You know, some countries might just muddle through. So I'm not apocalyptic about every country. And probably those countries with higher levels of sort of social capital, stronger civil societies and so on will do better than those that haven't. But historically, there have been countries which have been in situations which are not nearly as bad as those which I'm describing here, which have lost their independence as a result of accumulating too much debt. So Scotland, for example, in the late 17th century, developed a totally bizarre scheme to try to colonize part of Panama and called the Darien region, and in doing so incurred so much debt that the result of that was the 1707 Act of Union with England. So Scotland arguably lost its independence as a result of its high level of indebtedness. The same argument could be made for Newfoundland and Canada as well. If you look at countries in South America or interwar Germany, then the result of high levels of government debt are social chaos, hyperinflation, sometimes military coups, and hyperinflation from central banks essentially creating money in order to try to service debt, something which you know from this morning is not possible. And we might think that our countries are very different from the countries of South America where that's happened. But at the beginning of the 1930s, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, certainly in the top 10, possibly the fourth richest country in the world. And then from the 1930s to the 1970s, it increased government spending very rapidly on social and welfare programs, financed by printing money. That led to hyperinflation. Because the country could no longer sustain those social programs by printing money, it then started to borrow money on international debt markets, and the level of borrowing grew to such an extent that Argentina has defaulted several times, been a series of defaults. After one of those crises, the 2000 debt crisis, poverty more than doubled in 2 years. There was total social breakdown, and there was a general election in which the voters effectively went on strike and didn't vote. And I think altogether Argentina has had 9 defaults in its history. Whatever happens, though, I would assert, and I think I can assert this without fear of that I'll be proven wrong, but I won't be here to be proven wrong, that future generations, your generation, will for the first time in 200 years almost certainly be poorer than your predecessor generation. Whatever you think about environmental issues and climate change, and that might impose additional costs on you, the kind of obligations that my generation and previous generations have imposed on your generation in terms of the taxes necessary to provide for healthcare, social care and pensions will be such that I think it's more or less inevitable that you will be less well off than my own generation. Unless there are radical innovations that are such that productivity is transformed across a number of industries. I wish I could be a bit more optimistic, but afraid I can't. That's it.